Okay. Hi, I'm here with Dan Neuffer. As some people who are following the blog know, that we've been doing a series of recovery stories, recovering stories. And Health Rising has, I don't know, 65 or 70 recovery stories on the website. And they just run the gamut. They are from everything from people who've recovered doing pacing, to people who've recovered using supplements, to people who've recovered using drugs, to people who've recovered using mind-body therapies and treatments. And so Dan has recovered, and one thing I want to ask him about is his book, which really largely came, I understand, out of his recovery. And Dan has just been digging into recovery stories for longer than just about anyone. So I wanted to first I wanted to ask you, when did you start doing this, and when did you've been posting recovery stories on YouTube and talking to people really for almost as long as I can remember now. So when did you start doing this, and how many people have you talked to, and like that? Yeah.
Well, look, thanks first of all for having me on and exploring this, and I love that we have a positive topic to focus on, because ultimately recovery is all we want, right? We just all want to just get on with our lives. I'm pretty sure I was the first person to publish a recovery interview or recovery story on YouTube, and that happened about 9 or 10 years ago, and it happened after I recovered myself. I recovered after 7 years. I had CFS, and then periods of POTS, and then fibromyalgia. And I had actually given up on recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I had given up on recovery is because, well, like most of us, you try everything and nothing works.
Right.
And it just didn't seem likely. And I never heard of anyone else recovering.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And that was my motivation.
Yeah, you're at a point that many of us have reached. That I've reached. I mean, it's just like, you reach a point where you feel you kind of give up. But you apparently didn't give up. Something.
Well, actually, I did. I did give up.
You gave up on, didn't you? Yeah.
I gave up on recovery because obviously it wasn't working, and I never heard of anyone recovering, which is why after I recovered, one of the first things I want to do is I want to share my story, and then I want to share other people. I'd never heard of anyone who recovered, ever. In fact, to be frank, I didn't even know if other people had the illness, really, because I was kind of in my own little cocoon. And I had struggled a lot with the whole CFS diagnosis. I thought, is this really an illness, and blah, 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 blah. And so I was pretty ignorant, in my own little bubble. But afterwards, I wanted to share. I met all these people who'd recovered, and I'm like, I want to share their stories. Because I kind of thought, if I had known that someone else could recover, that it was possible, then maybe I would have tried to recover sooner, or not given up so much. I mean, obviously I tried to recover for years, but then I gave up and just tried to live with it until that was no longer feasible in my experience. So yeah, that was after I'd recovered, and I mean, that's like 10 years ago. I think I recovered about 11, 12 years ago, and I think I published these stories about 10 years ago.
Was that you created a YouTube? Was that in conjunction with writing the book that you created?
Yeah. So what happened is, when I recovered, and it was on the basis of a hypothesis, an explanation for the illness.
Okay. Right.
And I felt extremely confident that the hypothesis was correct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say 0% confident, but let's just say I did not feel confident at all that I would actually recover, despite feeling I understood how the illness works. But I thought it seemed possible, like theoretically. And then, so I wrote the book after I recovered. I then was obviously feeling a lot more positive about things, and I wrote the book to explain the hypothesis and also the framework for recovery. And I gave away 5,000 copies for free, and I just tried to get it out there, And then after that, I just did advocacy work. So I started doing these recovery interviews. I did it on YouTube, I did it on my website, and I started to do coaching in my not so spare time, whilst trying to sort of work during the day, and then at night I would just coach. It was difficult because I could only help so many people. It was all done pro bono, I wasn't charging anyone anything, and I did that for some years, and I just kept doing these interviews and sharing those and doing some blog articles. And I did that for, I don't know how many years, but a number of years. And the people kept saying, oh, Dan, do you have more help? And obviously I'd email people all over the world when they asked me questions to try and help them. But it didn't have that much of an impact. I mean, they'd say to me, oh, that's great and all this, but I'm like, how's it going to change your life, And they kept asking me for more resources, more coaching and all this kind of thing. And eventually I finally gave in and I created the ANS REWIRE program. But it was very difficult for me to do this because of the scope of it. I tend to like to do things in a bit of detail, and so I resisted for some time. But then I reached a point, Cord, where there was more pain associated with not doing it. And I thought, how would I feel on my deathbed about not having done that? And I thought, I'm going to feel regret. I feel like it's something I should do. And especially as I started to get feedback from people I'd helped and coached who start to recover, I felt a greater sense of obligation to do it. And so I finally took the plunge, sat down, wrote about 250,000 words, produced it, filmed it, published it, created ANS REWIRE. So that's how that came about. Yeah.
Sometimes it's when it becomes too painful not to do something, then you do it. Yeah.
You look, and I mean, this is a theme that comes up a lot.
If you have something to give and you don't give it,
yes,
that's painful. That can be painful.
It is. That was it. It was just like, I just felt like I would regret not doing it.
Yeah.
And finally that discomfort was strong enough to get over the discomfort of what I was facing. And,
right. Yeah. Stepping into a different world, really. Just a which
completely. I mean, the whole experience has been a bit weird for me.
Yes, I'm sure. I want to ask. You said you developed. Did you develop a hypothesis first about what was going on in ME/CFS, and then you applied it to yourself? Is that what happened?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's what happened.
Can you explain that a little bit? How that?
Well, I guess maybe I should give you context of my experience with the illness first, if you like.
Sure.
So I became, people say they get ill overnight. Some people. It was kind of like experience for me. Everything was fine. I was healthy. And then one day I went for a walk at lunch with my colleagues, and I couldn't keep up. And they were just meandering, They weren't power walking. And I'm like,
what were you doing at the time? What was your work?
I was actually working. I was trained as a scientist, as a physicist.
Oh.
And I'd worked some years, on things like medical lasers, working with surgeons on how to use the lasers. I worked with fiber optics and on these kind of things.
Easy.
And then
yeah,
well, compared to this stuff, it's easy, to be honest. And then I actually retrained to work as a like a number cruncher, an analyst, if you like, in the financial services industry.
Oh.
And that's what I was doing at this time. My son had been born about 18 months beforehand. It was a very stressful time. My wife nearly passed away several times. I had some, we had to say goodbye in emergency, this kind of thing. It was all pretty ugly. I did actually have PTSD, from which I had recovered. And I was working long hours, but because I was doing like some projects, outside of work, I'd gotten, during the time when after my son was born and with the PTSD, and I got a bit unhealthy, a bit chubby, and I hadn't been eating well, and so I was on an exercise kick. Actually, I was working out very hard with weights, and working long hours, but life was good. Mentally, we were all good. PTSD behind me, everything was fine, and then actually something had happened immediately before I had these issues with the walking, which I didn't connect until like many, many years later. And you might giggle at me, but I just, in my mind, even though it was immediately beforehand, I never connected it because I just didn't think like that. And I'd actually had a vaccination for chickenpox.
Oh.
And that's because someone had it at work, and I didn't know if I'd been vaccinated, and I didn't want to bring it home to the kids. We had all this drama in the year before. I'm like, I just want peace. I don't want to bring anything home. So I was supposed to have two, and I had my first one, and about 4 days later, maybe 4, 5 days, I'm not sure exactly, I had this problem with walking.
Wow.
And the same thing happened then. A day or two later, I was walking with my wife, and we were pushing a pram, and just a normal walk, and we get to the lights on the way home, and suddenly I'm like, I can't keep walking. I can't take another step. And she's looking at me going like, what do you mean? Like, this was my first experience where people don't believe you. I mean, my wife is lovely. Of course, I've never lied to her. Like, why would she think? But, it's impossible to understand. What do you mean you can't walk? Like, and I couldn't understand either. It was very weird, like your brain can't understand what's going on in that moment. Like, I just couldn't walk. Like, I felt like I couldn't take another step. And then shortly after, and it's a long time ago now, I don't know if it's the same day, the next day, or 2 days later, but I started to get like flu-like symptoms. And so, and then you have the body pains, you have the throat, the malaise, the whole thing, yeah. And I went to the doctor, and they basically just said, he looked at my throat and he goes, "Oh, how are you dealing with the pain?" And I go, "What pain?" He goes, "Well, your throat looks terrible. It's like really red, and I'm like, "Oh, I have no pain, I'm fine." And he gave me a script of antibiotics, and he gave me painkillers, which I thought was funny. Because I told him I had no pain, but he couldn't imagine how I could even cope with the level of pain I must be under. I'm like, I got no pain. And yeah, but it just kind of didn't work. I don't know. I was sick for a few weeks, and I felt a bit better, but I didn't feel quite right. And, it's the usual story after that, right? Days turn to weeks, weeks turn to months, months turn to years. And
Yeah.
I basically would have these flare-ups all the time. And it just wouldn't get better. And I went to one doctor who said, "Oh, I think you have a virus." And obviously, in hindsight, I was actually injected with the live virus. But I'm not saying that that's what was going on with me, but, but I kind of latched onto the idea of a virus because it felt like a virus.
Sure.
You get really fatigued and headaches and the whole malaise, and it feels like a virus. And he said, "Well, I've tested you for everything. The only thing that came up was Epstein-Barr, but it suggested that was a past infection or recent infection." And I'm like, I didn't even know I ever had that, And then, yeah, it just wouldn't get better. And what would happen is, you'd have these flare-ups every month or two, but in between the flare-ups, my health kept declining.
Yeah.
And like the fatigue got worse and worse. So even when you were good, I now was feeling terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And eventually I went to part-time work, and then I had to stop work altogether. And then I tried to be self-employed, work on and off, you know, for months at a time. You have a small young family. It really wasn't easy, you know. Um, I did all the doctor hopping that most of us do. I went to like, I don't know how many doctors, countless doctors, right? Obviously, sooner or later, I realized that I just kept getting the same blank stares, and it wasn't really going anywhere. And then, sort of as months turned to years, I started to do the alternative health hopping.
Hmm. At some point,
It wasn't really much more effective,
yeah.
but a lot more expensive.
Wait, you were diagnosed at some point with ME?
Yeah,
Huh?
yeah. Chronic fatigue syndrome was the first one, but I kind of ignored it.
Yeah,
Um,
don't we all?
because I'm like, no,
Yeah.
like fatigue. Like I don't have fatigue. Like,
Huh?
I mean, I do have fatigue, but it's terrible fatigue. But it's like, there's something wrong with me. Like I got like an infection or something. Like I'm getting sweats. I'm waking up at night. I can't sleep. It must be a viral thing. And that's what the doctor, one of the earliest doctors told me. Kind of, I just latched onto that, you know, and
Well, I don't.
and the symptoms kept growing, you know, like to the most bizarre stuff.
Hmm.
And so many symptoms. I felt like a hypochondriac, and one of the weirdest ones I remember. Often this would happen. I'd sit there and I'd get this feeling like a overwhelming sensation of smell almost. It was like almost like a gas, you know, like in my, and I'd be like, oh, like I'm choking, and I'd say to my wife, "What's that gas? Can you smell the gas?" And she's like, "What gas?" You're like, "What's wrong with you?" You know. That was one of the weird ones. There's one that I don't hear too often, but you know, maybe that was the onset of MCS. I don't know. I never really got MCS, but but yeah. So when doctors talk to me about chronic fatigue syndrome, I just kind of dismissed it and go, no, I got a real illness.
Yes. I, yeah, people embrace the idea of chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah.
Yeah, I was ignorant, you know,
Push that
and
away.
actually, I started to get periods of POTS,
Mm.
um, and I had several episodes lasting, you know, months, a few months each time, and then outside when they sort of stopped, where I wouldn't get that full racing heart, I would get just a normal orthostatic intolerance, you know, stand up, you know, woozy and all of this kind of thing, and the palpitations.
Yeah.
But it's kind of different than with the POTS, because the POTS is so obvious. You stand up and it feels like, you know, it's a million miles an hour. And then it was either just before I started to get the chronic pain, because I used to get pain during the flare-ups, right? When I'd be in bed. But then I started to get this daily pain,
Mm.
right? When I started to get fibromyalgia. And I think it was just before that or at the beginning of that I finally went one day at 3 o'clock in the morning. I decided to Google this chronic fatigue syndrome everyone keeps talking to me about. And I actually saw one of your blog articles.
Oh.
And it was a really lengthy blog. And, you know, I'd never spoken or read anything about it. I mean, it's stupid to dismiss something you don't know anything about, right? In hindsight, obviously, I should have listened, you know. But it was that kind of convinced me, because I'm looking at your experience and the symptoms and the detail. It was a really long post,
I'm
right?
not.
And I was like 3 o'clock in the morning. It's one of these sleepless nights. And I'm reading through all of this. I'm going, oh my God, this is exactly what I've got.
Mm.
And I was like, yeah, I'm getting kind of goosebumps even thinking about it, because like for so many years I had dismissed this, and for so many years I've got this mystery illness. Nobody just got anything like what I have. Nobody, right? I mean, how stupid. There's millions of people with this, but of course, no one I'd ever spoken to, right?
Right.
And suddenly I saw this in black and white, and like it was just, yeah, it was just uncanny. You know, when you hear the details of how this illness works and what we experience, it sort of becomes hard to deny that that's what you're experiencing. You know what I mean? It's, yeah. So yeah, that was kind of my experience, and then when the pain started was probably one of the most bizarre periods of this illness. There was a period somewhere in there, during the first 5 years, where actually I'd returned to health for a little while. I don't know how. Like, I was like maybe 90% well. I wasn't really getting the flare-ups, so I felt pretty good. I don't know how long that was for. 6 months. And then I got worse again, you know. But it's kind of weird having this period, you know, where I was kind of well. But when I had the fibromyalgia pain come on, that's when things got really weird, because one of the things I always experienced during the illness was alcohol intolerance. Like, I'd have like, not that I was much of a drinker, but if I go to barbecue and I'd have one beer, and then I'm like in bed for a week, like with a flare up. So when the daily pain came on, and it was pretty severe, I didn't really seek help. And what I did instead is I started drinking alcohol to cope. And what's so weird about that is, you know, I just told you I got a complete alcohol intolerance. Like, I drink one beer, I'm completely messed up. So how did I go now to drinking alcohol every day in the afternoon? Because typically the pain would get worse as the day went on. Towards the afternoon, suddenly it would really come on. And I would start drinking alcohol. And like, to this day, I look back at that time and go, like, how's that even possible? You know, it's just kind of weird. But what happened next was that I moved. I had to move house. And when I moved house, you know, there's a lot involved, as you know. And when you have CFS, like, you know,
incredible.
Moving a bookshelf is like more than you can deal with in your life, right? Or unpacking a box, right? And now I'm moving a whole house. And basically, within a week afterwards, I ended up the sickest I've been. And so I'd often been couch-bound, you know, for weeks. I'd been bed-bound often for like days or a week, where I was really very sick. But suddenly I was actually like permanently bedbound. Like, I was proper ill, and now I'm like lying in bed for like months instead of days. And I think only a person with CFS can appreciate what I'm talking about here. But I remember, I you know, when we get that feeling where you feel like you're made out of lead.
Yeah.
Well, it was so bad. I couldn't move my hand. I couldn't lift my hand off the bed, and I wouldn't speak. And anyone who's listening to this, by the way, you got to recognize, you hear these horror stories. This doesn't mean it's going to happen to you. To most people, I believe this doesn't happen. Okay, so don't get freaked out by it, or don't think, oh, well, maybe that's going to happen to me. It's probably not going to happen to you. I hear these things sometimes, but it's mostly you don't have to be scared of this as happening to you. But what happened is I pushed, obviously. I had to move. You can't just not move. I had to move, right? And you find a way to, remember packing these cars, doing one trip after the other, filling my cars with all this junk. Wish I just burnt it on the front yard in hindsight, you know? And, yeah, and I struggled to speak. And I can't even remember this period of time.
Yeah.
Like, it's like a fog. In fact, it was like something like over a decade later. I remember one morning walking with my wife. We're on our walk, and I turned around and I was a bit upset with her. I was a bit angry and a bit upset. And I'm like, why didn't you take me to hospital? Like, I mean, I felt like I was dying. I remember lying there and I felt like, you know, each beat of the heart was like, it was like a laboring of the heart, you know. You're just lying there and struggling to breathe, and you're just so heavy and you can't talk. I'm like, why didn't you take me to hospital? And she said, I tried to take you to hospital, but you didn't want to. I'm like, really? She goes, yeah, you were like completely against it. And I didn't know, I didn't remember any of this. I've been walking around for like 10 years going, why didn't she do something, you know? And it's like, oh, okay, it was me. And And I think it may have been, I was hospitalized before, some years earlier, maybe a couple of years before this happened, where I was actually dying of food poisoning.
Oh.
And I've been ill for like 2 weeks. I mean, I was like, I think dying of food poisoning is not a exaggeration. You know, I was, but I thought it was a flare up.
Oh.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when I eventually ended up in hospital, and I'm like there, and I remember I ended up crying in the hospital, going, I don't know what this is. I've had this for years. It's some mystery illness. Blah 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 blah. And they're like, oh, he's clearly emotional and all this. I'm like, well, you'd be emotional if you've been sick for years when no one can help you. And now look where I am. I'm lying here. And then it turned out they did blood tests and turned out I had a really severe food poisoning. Yeah. So, and I think maybe that's what made me not want to go to hospital, because I'm like, what are they going to do for me?
Right. Of course. The natural.
So basically, I was there. I don't know exactly how long. It was probably 2 months, I reckon, which is a long time to be lying in bed.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And this is actually good, Dan, because I didn't know things got so bad for you. I mean, they got really bad, much worse than they've ever been for me. And yet here you are. You were able to recover. So that suggests that, you know, you can really get really sick. And we'll talk about this. You know, people you've known who've been so sick that, you know, you really think that they can't recover. But for me, this is helpful.
My experience is by no means unique, you know. But I guess what happened is, I finally, after about 2 months, I managed to crawl out of bed to the couch. And it was Christmas Day. And I couldn't actually sit at the table to eat dinner, right? I forget, obviously, helping. But, so I was just on the couch. I don't think I even ate anything. But I remember I had 2 kids, you know, 2 and 6-year-old, right? And this is when Christmas is the most magic. And I couldn't unwrap the presents.
No.
And when they were unwrapping the presents, you know, as a dad, you're always going to suck it up, right? But I couldn't crack a smile whilst they were unwrapping their presents. And it wasn't because I was depressed. It was because I didn't have the physical energy to smile.
Right.
I just sat there like a zombie, like this. And I'm like, and I remember thinking, my decision to just live with this illness as best as I can, it isn't feasible anymore.
Okay.
Like, it's just not practical, right? Because that'd be my decision. You know, nothing works, so just live with it, you know, manage it, whatever. But that suddenly didn't seem like a feasible approach. Yeah. And then it was a few weeks later, after New Year's, when I finally managed to crawl out, and I think I got more mobile. And I don't know why I got better, by the way. Like, it's not like I did anything.
Well, you didn't do.
I wasn't seen anywhere.
Yeah. Maybe that. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe that. I'm sure that helped.
Well, maybe, you know. And then I was sitting in the study and looking out. It was beautiful, hot summer day, and, you know, blue sky. And I'm looking through the curtain, little gap in the curtain in my dingy little study, because it was dark. And I just had this thought: I have to work it out, because clearly no one's going to work it out for me.
Okay.
And I told my wife, I'm going to work out what causes this illness, because I don't want to treat symptoms. I'm sick of doing that. That just doesn't work. And she looked at me and goes, yes, I think you will. And then I thought, crap, what have I just said? Because obviously this is completely unrealistic and unlikely. My background's not in medical science or anything. And so then that's basically, as I started to get better, I just committed myself to reading. And I didn't want to look at treating the illness. I was not interested in that. I wanted to understand, why is it happening?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I basically committed myself to for the next 3 to 6 months.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Just learning.
Just learning. I'd look at stuff. I'd go into medical universities, and look at pulling papers, and I'd look at like what do we know?
Right.
What do we know? We know weird stuff, like people are low in magnesium, for instance, often, right? I go, well, why are they low in magnesium? And what is magnesium used for? And well, what's the reason for this? And then I tried to find one explanation that would just explain it all,
Mhm.
right? And I came up with all kinds of weird harebrained ideas, which were complete red herrings. I remember at one stage, because I was really fixated about this alcohol intolerance. It's very tangible.
Mhm.
You know, you drink one beer and then you're like completely messed up. Like, what is that, right? There must be a reason. So I had a look at alcohol metabolism, and I thought, maybe I've got like a acetaldehyde dehydrogenase deficiency, and that would kind of explain. Then you like end up with basically formaldehyde poisoning, and I feel poisoned. I often, when you have CFS, you get that feeling where you feel like you're poisoned. I thought, yeah, maybe this is it. But then, of course, that didn't explain everything.
Right. Right.
For one, it didn't explain why am I sick when I don't drink alcohol. So, yeah, it was all these different. But then, obviously, everyone would have already worked this out. You would have done tests on everyone, and we would have long ago worked out CFS is caused by this, or that's what it is, right? So, I went down all these red herrings, and then eventually I started to form a hypothesis, right? And an explanation. And when I did, it started to explain how all the symptoms are created, right? It started to explain why we get affected or triggered by all these different things that we do. It explains why people get ill in different ways. I mean, how bizarre is that? One person does this, one person does that, one person has an accident, one has a surgery, one has a psychological breakdown, one exercises. I mean, one gets a flu. How does this make sense for one illness, right? And then you get all these different symptoms. And so it kind of explained all of it. And I felt very satisfied with the explanation. And that explanation, in summary, was that there's lots of dysfunctions. Right? It's funny, we go to a doctor and go, there's nothing wrong. Do a blood test, there's nothing wrong. Except for little minor changes for many of us, right? And like, some weird white blood cell counts, or they talk about different infections and things. But most of the time, so many of us hear there's nothing wrong. And it's like, the truth couldn't be further from the truth. It's not like what's wrong in CFS. It's almost like what's right, because nothing's working properly. But the problem is, it's not broken, right? Like if you look at Addison's disease, it's very clear. There's no adrenal hormones. Well, we can even test it. We can do a stimulation test. There you go. It's broken. Or Cushing's disease, right? Or type 1 diabetes, or all these illnesses. It's very clear. It's broken. But with us, one person's like this, the next person's different. And even for one person, it changes over time. I mean, it's also confusing. So this explanation about the secondary dysfunctions, which are numerous, and that the primary dysfunction is a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, it satisfied my questions. And so I felt, this is it. I felt very confident. And I thought theoretically that should mean if it's dysfunctioning, and sometimes I feel better and sometimes I don't, theoretically it should be possible to recover. But I have to tell you, I had zero belief that I was going to recover. I just couldn't imagine myself being a well person. In fact, I go so far, Court, that even when I was recovered, I remember about 3 to 6 months after I'd recovered, I'd been running. I've never been a runner, but I did it just out of novelty, after 7 years of not being able to do anything. And I remember I was running down this road on a sunny day, and I go, I had this moment where I thought, trying to imagine myself being a well person. And like, I've been symptom-free for quite a long time. I was running, and even at that time, I couldn't imagine myself as someone who isn't broken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, this is so entrenched in my psyche,
Yeah.
that even when I was recovered, I couldn't see myself as a well person,
Still hadn't gotten it, really.
No, it was very hard to make that shift mentally,
Hmm.
So yeah, basically that led to me writing CFS Unraveled, and then as I said, eventually I created ANS REWIRE, and I spent years just doing advocacy work, trying to spread the hope to people that recovery is possible, even though there's no cure, obviously.
Mm-hmm. So the autonomic nervous system is the central locus. You see it as the central locus, and so there are different. I imagine there are different attempts to put it back on track that you went through, and some of them worked.
Well, it was a gradual process, you know, like it didn't happen overnight, and you know, one of the weird things was I realized as I was starting to return to sort of being able to function somewhat again. First of all, I went back to some doctors. I started to get treatments, mainly to support my gut. I started to make dietary changes. But one of the things I'd noticed, this was probably before, one of the things I'd noticed actually before I formed my hypothesis was, I remember this distinct thing. I went to brush my daughter's teeth. She was only little. And I remember as I was brushing her teeth, that I was so stressed out about this thing of brushing her teeth. Yeah. It was like I was diffusing a bomb.
Yeah.
Right?
And I
just need to get it finished. Do you know, there was this urgency because, you know, any task you do, you've got to get it finished because you've got to lie down again, don't you? You've got to sit down again. And here I'm standing and I'm brushing teeth and it's like, get it finished so you can sit down. And then I suddenly realized, this is crazy. Like, what is wrong with me? Like,
right.
Like I'm just brushing a little girl's teeth.
Yes. Yes. Enormous tension. Yeah.
Tension in my body, and I wasn't breathing. It's like this, and I'm like,
no, exactly.
I'm like, do I have a mental disorder, or what is going on here? Like, this is just weird. It's just weird, and that was one of the early things I remember that started making me think that there must be something wrong with the nervous system, because this is not normal behavior. This is not me. Right. Like, what is this? This is just strange. But yeah, I mean, I recovered, but by focusing on the brain, I started to do, I treated myself physically, and I started to do stuff to try and affect how the brain works. Yeah. And
rewire the brain.
I looked at rewire the brain. Absolutely. And one of the things is meditation as well. Yeah.
The brain's kind of going crazy, isn't it? I mean, witness your
it is
incredible tension trying to do this really simple thing. Oh, yeah. Okay.
And like you stand up and like, you know, that feeling, all the blood goes out of you, or you get the heart racing like crazy. Yeah. I mean, what is going on here? You know, and there's nothing wrong with your heart apparently. So, yeah, try to make sense of that. But it explained, the autonomic nervous system explained everything. It explained why our minerals are out of whack. You know, it explained the gut issues. Yeah, and really, I don't look at these. People think they're so unlucky. Oh, I've got CFS, and then I got POTS, and then I got IBS, and then I got fibromyalgia, and then I got hypothyroidism, and I got this. No, I mean, think about it. You would have to be the most unluckiest person on the planet to have so many different diseases. It's one illness.
Ah, okay. Different brain.
It's all one illness.
Right.
Right? It's just different symptoms. And the way I always explain to people is you could go in the house and go, oh, I'm so unlucky. This house has got stinking carpet. And this house it's got mold on the walls. And it's got like tiles that are lifting. And it's got this and it's got that. No. You don't have 50 problems. You have a hole in the roof and water's coming in. And that's it. You have one problem.
Okay.
And all of these things are just results.
So were there any specific things that really dramatically helped, or was it a bunch of, you know, trying to calm the nervous autonomic? Because I know you can train the autonomic nervous system to some extent. It's one of the systems of the body that I know you can you can train through meditation or other things, breathing
Yes.
techniques.
Yes.
Um,
Well, look, there wasn't one magic thing, or there wasn't like a fast change for me.
well, darn
Yeah,
it, I
you
know.
know,
Yeah,
and that made it really difficult actually, because
yeah.
I remember I started to, well, obviously I made progress. I was out of bed. I was out off the couch. I started to be able to leave the house, obviously. You know, I even had gone to libraries and researching and all this kind of thing. So I was sort of in that semi-functional state again. And I thought I was on this recovery path. You know, I had this explanation and I was doing all these different things. And I started doing yoga. I went to like this old people's yoga class in a community center, right? And everyone was like 30, 20, 30, 40 years older than me. One of the ladies was actually coming in a wheelchair, right? For this yoga class. And I'd been going there for a few weeks and I was getting all this hope because obviously I'd lost hope on recovery. And I was starting to get this hope again. Oh, maybe I can recover. Maybe this can happen, you know. I believe this is what's going on and I'm getting better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I went, like I've been going maybe for 6 weeks or 4 weeks, I don't remember. And I went to do this yoga class and I walked in and within minutes when we started, I couldn't do it. So we started with, I remember the pose, not that I'm a yoga person, right? But I remember she did warrior pose, like this. And as I did this, the moment I did this, I'm like, I can't hold my arm up. And then I'm like, yes, I can. I'm recovering. It's getting better. I'm like, I really can't do this. I'm like, I have to do this. And then it's this moment, because if you now decide you can't do it and you're going to stop doing it, what does that mean? Like, it means that you've been kidding yourself, deluding yourself that you're getting better, right? So I'm like, I'm trying to muscle through this. Yes, I can just, you know, and eventually I'm like, I can't. You can't mind over matter this illness. And no matter how motivated I was and believed I could do it, I couldn't do it. There was no way. And so my arms just plopped down and I had to leave. Whilst I'm walking past the lady in the wheelchair in the back who's sitting there like this, strong, right? And when I got back, that was probably the lowest moment in my whole illness. People always think it would be when I was bedbound and all of this. I can't even remember half of that. But this I remember.
Yeah.
And I came home and I broke down. I broke down. My wife was at work. I was home alone. Kids were at kindy in school, and I burst into tears. I called Lifeline. First time I'd ever done anything like that. I called Lifeline. I was so distressed because I'm like, I can't believe I fell for it again. You know, like I promised myself not to try and recover again, because every time someone told me, oh, it's this, or you have your gut, and you know these treatments, and you know, I did hear so many stories over the years, and so many treatments, and you get your hopes up, and you try stuff, and you rest, and you think you're feeling better, and then it doesn't work, right? And that's why I had decided I'm not going to try and recover again. This is bull dust. Unless someone can give me something 100% written in stone that this works and it works for everyone else, I'm not going to do it. And so finally, through this desperation, I had gone through this recovery path. And in that moment, I suddenly go, it's all bull dust. I've just been kidding myself, trying to make myself, deluding myself, thinking I can recover or that I'm recovering. And yeah, I that was a bad day. That was a bad day. But to be fair, the next day, I just looked at it and I thought, you know what? I have been going to yoga classes, you know, and it's so easy, and I had made progress. I mean, I was in bed, and now I'm going to yoga classes. So It's so easy when there's so much emotional baggage of years of suffering that something happens and we just blow up and we just get overwhelmed because we give things too much meaning. It's really hard to be objective about your own illness when you suffer so severely and has such an emotional impact for so many years. So I dusted myself off
Right.
and got on with it. And yeah, look, over a period, it took me somewhere like I say 12 to 18 months to recover. I say because you don't know when you're recovered. Like, how do you know you're recovered? Like it's a spectrum, isn't it? Like you don't just go,
Right.
oh, it's fixed now, right? So you're feeling better and you're having less flare-ups, and then you're not really getting flare-ups, and you feel pretty good. And somewhere in that 12 to 18 months, I would say I was fully recovered because I wasn't getting flare-ups, and because I was able to function, I was able to work, I was able to exercise. But like as time progressed, your level of energy and vitality still increases. Yeah, this is why I got people
Yes.
telling
Yes.
me
Yeah.
all the time, "Oh yeah, I was 100% recovered, but now I'm like 120% recovered." which which
Okay.
obviously doesn't make
Okay.
any sense. But so people tell me they think they're fully recovered, and then like 6 months later, whilst they were symptom free, and so you can say recovered, but 6 months later, 12 months later, they have more health, more energy. Yes,
Hmm. They've forgotten. They've forgotten what it's.
that's basically my experience, my personal experience.